82 years after a German officer vanished without a trace, his secret shelter has finally surfaced beneath the moss. What they found inside wasn't just history, it was a confession written for the forest itself. Before we close the journal and step away from the quiet breathing of the forest where the air still hums with secrets and a name remains etched in concrete, pause with us. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support isn't just encouragement, it's preservation, a way to keep memory from sinking beneath the moss and time. Every click is a signal to the past that someone is still listening. Every share is another voice carried into the silence. You are the reason these stories rise again from the earth. Thank you for walking with us into the places history tried to bury. The forest had swallowed nearly everything the war had left behind. Trees rose from old trenches. Roots split helmets, shells, and bones alike. When the explorers first stumbled upon the mound, they thought it was just another collapsed air raid shelter from the 1940s, one of hundreds left to rot in the dense silence of Eastern Europe. But as they brushed aside the moss and soil, their gloved hands met cold, smooth concrete. Not the rough kind poured in haste for military bunkers, but something deliberate, something almost domestic in its precision. A square outline emerged beneath years of decay. A doorway sealed shut with steel rivets, hidden beneath a skin of ivy and mud. The air turned colder the deeper they dug, as if the earth itself guarded the memory of what lay below. When the rusted latch finally gave way, a long sigh of air escaped, carrying the stale scent of oil, paper, and dust untouched by sunlight for more than 80 years. Their flashlight beams pierced the dark. Inside, the space was smaller than they expected. No war room, no weapon cache, just a single cramped chamber. The concrete walls were unpainted but clean. The floor was lined with rotted wooden planks, their edges curled like old paper. Against the far wall sat a cot, still holding the faint outline of a body long gone. Beside it, an enamel cup, a lantern, and a single pair of boots arranged neatly, as though waiting for a return that never came. Then the beam of light caught something glinting near the corner, a pistol, its metal pitted and orange with rust. Next to it, a book wrapped in oilcloth. The explorers unwrapped it slowly, their breath fogging the air. Inside was a journal, its first page dated the 17th of October 1943. The handwriting was meticulous, angular, the script of a soldier. And tucked between two pages was a photograph, still astonishingly clear. A young woman smiling faintly at the camera, her hair pinned in the style of the era. Someone had kept her safe in the dark all these years. The explorers spoke quietly, their voices careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. Every object felt personal, deliberate. This was not a command post. It was a refuge, a place built for one man who had chosen solitude over surrender. One of them found a ration tin on a shelf, the label faded but still legible in Gothic script. Another found the remains of a uniform jacket, its buttons bearing the eagle insignia of the German Wehrmacht. Dust drifted in their flashlight beams like fine ash. The explorers began photographing everything, documenting angles, textures, objects, as if they were walking through someone's memory, piece by piece. One whispered that the shelter felt wrong, too quiet, as if it had been listening all this time. Outside, the forest barely moved. No birds called. No wind stirred the leaves. It was as though the trees themselves had bent inward over the decades, protecting this secret. What began as an archaeological curiosity was quickly reported to local authorities, and within days, historians arrived with ground-penetrating radar and excavation tools. The initial theory was simple: a lost German outpost from the retreat of 1944. But that explanation unraveled quickly. There were no communications lines, no supply markings, no evidence of multiple occupants. Only one man had lived here, and perhaps died here. The shelter's location was odd too, several kilometers from any known frontline position. It was not a defensive structure, nor part of any mapped installation. It was personal, hand-built, perhaps even against orders. When the diary was opened and translated, its first lines would ignite a storm of speculation. "I can hear the forest breathe at night. It knows I am here." The words carried the weight of fear, of isolation, and of something unspeakable lurking just beyond the concrete walls. As the last beam of light flickered across the shelter's entrance, one of the archaeologists noted something faintly etched into the concrete above the door, barely visible under the grime. A name, carved by hand, Reinhard Vogel, 1943. And beneath it, almost invisible, a smaller line of script, Nurich Blabe. "Only I remain." The forest around them stood still, as if listening. In the brittle grain of black and white film, Captain Reinhard Vogel appears for the first time, a man in his early 30s, square-jawed, his posture precise, even when the world around him crumbled. The footage, rediscovered in a forgotten military archive outside Berlin, shows him stepping from a command truck near the Polish border in late 1943. His expression is difficult to read, neither proud nor weary, but something in between. Historians would later pause the footage at the moment he glances toward the camera, not out of vanity, but as if he senses he's being remembered against his will. His file, once stamped Geheim classified, was declassified decades later. The documents inside were yellowed, brittle, and incomplete. Pages torn out, sections blacked by censors long dead. Still, a rough outline emerged. Vogel was an intelligence officer assigned to the 12th Army Group, tasked with reconnaissance deep behind advancing Soviet lines. His mission, according to what little survived, was to locate and secure sensitive assets left behind by retreating divisions. No mention was made of what those assets were, or why a single officer was sent instead of a unit. On November 3, 1943, his convoy departed from an outpost near Lublin. 3 days later, it vanished without a trace. In the official report, his superior officer wrote simply, "Unit presumed lost due to enemy engagement. No remains recovered." But even in the chaos of retreat, the story didn't sit right. Other officers stationed nearby recalled that Vogel's unit left quietly, without formal orders recorded in the daily logs. And when his subordinates were questioned after the war, the accounts diverged sharply. One remembered Vogel acting strangely in the days leading up to their mission, distant, distracted, obsessively studying maps of the forests east of Chelm. Another claimed he burned a pile of documents the night before they left. The rest refused to speak. In post-war interviews, a surviving soldier from a neighboring regiment mentioned rumors of a special detachment operating independently under Vogel's command. He described hearing distant machinery and seeing faint light in the woods during that same week, followed by the dull echo of explosions. When Soviet troops later swept through the region, they found nothing but scorched trees and shallow craters, as if the forest itself had been erased. Historians searching for corroboration found only fragments transport manifests showing equipment requisitioned by Vogel that was never returned, fuel records that didn't match his supposed route, and a final telegram sent from a remote field station reading, "Mission proceeding as instructed. Conditions worsening. Will establish position." No further communication followed. What stands out in the declassified correspondence is the silence that followed his disappearance. The Wehrmacht's bureaucracy, meticulous even amid collapse, did not issue a follow-up investigation. His personnel file was closed in January 1944, months before the front shifted. The notation beside his name read, "Vermisst, presumed dead." Yet decades later, forensic archivists noticed something strange. A handwritten note, added in red pencil sometime after the war, beside his file number. Location unverified, possible voluntary absence. The implication was clear. Someone had suspected Vogel didn't die in battle. He may have walked away. The narrative of desertion became the convenient truth, whispered among veterans who'd long stopped asking questions. Some said he fled into the forest to escape prosecution for insubordination. Others hinted at something darker, that Vogel had seen or discovered something he wasn't supposed to, and that his disappearance was orchestrated. But there were no witnesses, no official pursuit, and no closure. His name faded from rosters and rolls, from the collective memory of a war that produced too many ghosts to count. Still, the few who handled his file in the years after noted an odd consistency. Attached to several pages were brief cross-references to an unidentified project, known only as Operation Nachtsicht Night Vision. The project's file number led to nothing. It was as if the designation itself had been erased from every subsequent archive. And so, the story of Captain Reinhard Vogel dissolved into rumor and dust. Until, 82 years later, the forest that had swallowed him gave up its secret, a concrete shelter buried in silence, and the faint trace of a man who may have chosen exile over obedience. His name, carved in the wall, became the final entry in a record that history had tried to forget. The letters were folded neatly, each one pressed flat between pages of the officer's diary, as if he had meant to send them but never found the courage or the means. The paper had yellowed to the color of smoke, the ink bled faintly where dampness had touched it. At first, they read like ordinary wartime correspondence, polite, careful, written in the precise hand of a man who still believed the world outside the forest would continue as it always had. "My dearest Clara," the first began, "I am well, and the mission progresses without difficulty. The air here is cold, but clean. It reminds me of the lake at Altona, where we walked last summer." His words painted scenes of domestic memory against the desolation of war. He wrote about the frost on the trees, about a stray dog that had followed his men for a week, about how he longed for the sound of her piano through the open window. He asked about her mother, her brother, her students at the music school. He ended with a promise that he would return before the winter was through. But as the letters continued, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew uneven, hurried, as though written under strain. The second and third letters described the endless forest, the silence that pressed against the shelter like a living thing. "There are no birds here. Even the air feels reluctant to move." He mentioned mechanical failures, missing supplies, and men who argued in whispers when they thought he was asleep. "I begin to think," he wrote, "that we are being punished for something none of us understand." By the fourth letter, the structure of his sentences had begun to fray. Words were crossed out, rewritten, repeated. He described sleepless nights, hearing voices carried through the trees. "It's only the wind, they tell me," he wrote, "but the wind does not call my name." He asked Clara if she had received his previous letters, though none of them had ever left the bunker. "If I could only hear your voice again," he continued. "Perhaps I could believe that the world beyond these trees still exists." Historians later studied the ink, confirming that each letter had been written days, sometimes weeks apart. The last two were the most disturbing. One was half a confession, half a farewell. "I no longer believe in the orders we were given," it began. "The maps make no sense. The roads end where they should not. At night, the forest glows faintly, as if lit from beneath the ground. I think perhaps we were never meant to return." The tone was unsteady, fragmented, as if the writer had started to lose the boundary between reality and imagination. The final letter ended mid-sentence. "Clara," it began, "I can hear them outside again. Not the men, not the enemy, something else. I have sealed the door. If you ever read this, know that." The ink trailed off. The line dragged into the margin, where the pen must have slipped from his hand. Archivists noted that his writing materials, fountain pen, ink, envelopes, were carefully arranged near the cot where his remains should have been. The letters had never been sealed, never addressed for posting. It was as if Vogel had written them not for Clara, but for himself, to preserve the last fragments of his humanity as the war consumed him. In the silence of the archive room, when the historians read those letters aloud, It was impossible not to feel the slow collapse of a man's mind within the confinement of that shelter. Each line carried the erosion of certainty, the unraveling of purpose. What began as devotion had become a confession of dread. The soldier who once wrote of honor and duty ended his story trembling in isolation. Unsure whether he was hunted by men, by memory, or by something his mind could no longer name. And as the camera lingers on the last unfinished letter, the viewer can almost hear the sound he must have heard that final night. Not the echo of war, but the forest breathing just outside his door. The fragments of Vogel's assignment surfaced decades after his disappearance, buried deep within the German Federal Archives under a collection marked Foreign Operations Division, 1943. Most of the papers were mundane supply ledgers, fuel requests, coded transmissions, but several carried his signature, confirming his connection to a covert transport detail known as Sondergruppe 9. The purpose of that unit was never clearly recorded. Its directives were redacted or missing entirely, leaving only partial entries that hinted at the movement of classified biological materials from a research facility in Silesia to an undisclosed destination east of Lublin. The documentation referred to the cargo only by an acronym, VRM. No one could later determine what it meant. One surviving memo, written by a superior officer, described the mission in vague but unsettling terms. Ensure containment, no deviation, no record. The phrasing implied not only secrecy but fear. There was no mention of weaponry or intelligence, yet the order carried the highest level of classification available in the Wehrmacht at that time. The names of Vogel's subordinates were omitted, replaced with numbers. The date of departure, November 3, 1943, matched precisely with the day his convoy vanished. In Vogel's diary, recovered from the bunker decades later, there was only one direct reference to the operation. His handwriting, usually careful and deliberate, trembled across the page. We were told it was a delivery, nothing more. Sealed crates, 6 of them. Temperature controlled. The men asked questions I could not answer. One of the boxes moved. He never wrote what was inside. Instead, the next entry began with the cryptic line, "It's not what they told us, it's alive." Researchers who studied the document could never determine whether Vogel's words were metaphorical or literal. Some believed alive referred to coded intelligence living witnesses, perhaps prisoners, transported for interrogation. Others proposed a darker possibility. During the final years of the war, several German laboratories conducted biological experiments under the guise of medical research. Their existence was denied for decades. Yet fragments of testimony hinted at projects involving nerve agents, parasitic infections, and regenerative tissue studies. If Sondergruppe 9 was attached to one of these, then Vogel's fear might have stemmed from first-hand knowledge of something both human and unnatural. In one of his later diary entries, he described an incident during transport. "We stopped near the woods. One of the containers had begun to leak. Inside, something pulsed. Private Krauss refused to go near it. He said he heard breathing. I told him it was just the air pressure, but I knew it wasn't. It was slower, rhythmic. The next page was nearly torn in half, as though he had tried to remove it. The remaining lines were smudged beyond recognition, yet one phrase stood out beneath the ink. We buried the crate. I could still hear it." By the time the convoy reached the coordinates of their final stop, the diary suggested that half the men were gone, some reassigned, others missing. Vogel wrote that he had received new orders directly from Berlin, though the message was unsigned. Maintain isolation until further instruction. Secure remaining material. Report anomalies. No instructions ever followed. Weeks later, his handwriting collapsed into panic. "The air stinks of metal," he wrote. "The forest hums at night. There is light beneath the ground. I think it knows we are here." Modern historians attempted to verify the existence of WWII through Allied intelligence archives, but found no record of its creation or dissolution. What little survived was destroyed in 1945 during the collapse of the Eastern Front. The only evidence that remained was Vogel's testimony, captured in a diary not meant for public eyes, and a handful of coded transmissions referencing containment status and loss of sample integrity. When analysts decrypted those messages, they discovered something chilling. The phrase "loss of sample" appeared just once, followed by the coordinates that matched the forest where Vogel's shelter would later be found. Whether the mission had been an attempt to move something biological, chemical, or supernatural will never be known. But one detail endures across every record, every whispered retelling. Vogel never tried to escape. He sealed himself inside that bunker and waited, not for rescue, but for silence. The last words in his file, handwritten in red pencil by an unknown archivist, read simply, "Cargo presumed neutralized. Personnel status unknown." And somewhere in the forest, beneath the moss and earth, the air still hums faintly when the wind passes low, as though something old and forgotten continues to breathe. In the winter of 1943, when the snow lay heavy across the plains of eastern Poland, the forest beyond the village of Krashen was sealed by the Wehrmacht under orders no one understood. Villagers spoke of trucks arriving after midnight, their engines muted, their headlights covered. Soldiers moved in silence, rolling barbed wire through the drifts, hammering signs into trees that warned in 3 languages to keep away. The locals obeyed, not out of loyalty but fear. Even the partisans stayed clear of that stretch of woods. They said the air inside was wrong, too still, too heavy. By day, smoke rose between the pines, black and thin like a single thread reaching for the sky. By night, the glow began. Some said it looked like fireflies. Others said it pulsed, red and green, as if something below the earth was breathing. Those who ventured close enough to see swore they heard machinery humming beneath the ground. Not tanks or engines, but something deeper, slower, like the turning of enormous gears under the soil. The stories spread quietly among the villagers, shared only at night, around stoves that burned low. One farmer claimed he saw men in gas masks dragging crates into the forest, their boots leaving no prints in the snow. Another swore he watched a truck leave at dawn carrying only officers, its canvas cover dripping with frost and something darker. None of the villagers ever saw the soldiers return. When the spring thaw came, the wire fence was still there, but the guard post stood empty. Whatever had been built in the forest was now left to rot. No one went near it again. 80 years later, the forest still carries that silence. It's thicker now, layered by time and moss. Drone footage from modern explorers shows an unnatural symmetry to the trees rows that should not exist in a natural woodland. Beneath that canopy, soil depressions stretch in perfect alignment, as though a structure far larger than Vogel's shelter lies buried below. The team that found his bunker noticed this pattern first, a ring of circular indentations surrounding the site, each nearly 10 meters across, visible only from above. Ground-penetrating radar revealed faint metallic echoes at irregular depths, scattered like fragments of a forgotten machine. Some of the signals were strong enough to suggest intact chambers, others faded into nothing, as if the metal itself resisted the scan. The forest surface gives no clues. No rubble, no concrete remains, just a subtle unevenness in the earth where sunlight struggles to reach. Even the animals avoid it. Thermal imaging at night shows colder patches in places where the ground should retain heat. One investigator described it as a living absence, a place where sound dies too quickly, where footsteps seem absorbed. When they replayed the audio captured by drones hovering above the shelter, faint rhythmic pulses could be heard beneath the natural background noise, low vibrations, repeating every few seconds, almost like breathing. Experts dismissed it as interference, but those who visited the site spoke differently. One described feeling watched, Another claimed his compass spun aimlessly near the bunker's entrance, refusing to settle. Local legend has transformed over time, shaped by rumor and fear. The older villagers still speak of the metal forest, saying the trees grow in patterns that mirror what lies below. They claim that on some winter nights, when the fog hangs low, the lights return green glows that drift between the trunks before vanishing into the ground. Some younger residents have turned the story into folklore, calling it haunted or cursed, but their grandparents still cross themselves when they speak of it. For them, it's not superstition, it's memory. They remember the soldiers who came and never left, the hum beneath the snow, the strange stillness that followed. In recent years, historians and engineers have proposed digging beneath the site, but the Polish government has repeatedly denied excavation permits, citing ecological preservation. Unofficially, some say there's a deeper reason. The forest rests on unstable ground, riddled with voids that could collapse without warning. Yet the data remains compelling. The radar images outline something unmistakable, a geometric structure spreading far beyond Vogel's shelter, as if his small refuge was just the surface node of an intricate network. The dimensions defy logic for a wartime build, stretching hundreds of meters underground in symmetrical patterns. When night falls, the modern footage captures the forest in grayscale silence, the same as it must have looked to Vogel in those final days. Wind moves softly through the pines, whispering in a language too old to translate. And if one listens long enough, beyond the static of the recording, there's a moment where the sound deepens, like an unseen current shifting below the earth. It's the same hum the villagers once feared, the one that never really stopped. The forest remains, waiting, its roots wrapped around whatever the soldiers left behind, watching with the patience of something that has already seen too much. The last entries in Vogel's diary begin with precision, the kind that soldiers cling to when order is all they have left. Each day marked with neat numerals, the weather recorded, the rations listed in careful measure. "Cold," he wrote one morning, "and no bread left. The air burns when I breathe." His words remained disciplined, even as the handwriting trembled. He noted that his men were gone, that they had moved into the trees 2 nights earlier. No explanation, no farewell, just the implication that something had drawn them away. "I heard them speaking outside," he wrote, but the words were not German anymore. After that, the structure of the diary began to fracture. Sentences broke apart mid-thought, replaced by fragments of imagery and strange repetition. He described footsteps circling the shelter at night, soft as falling snow. "The ration tins clattered once," he said, though no one was near them. He wrote of lights moving through the forest like slow embers drifting between the trunks. He began to question the shape of time, wondering whether the sun still rose beyond the canopy, or if he was trapped in some endless dusk. "The trees move when I sleep," he wrote. "They whisper orders I no longer follow." It is unclear how long he remained alive after those words. Days, perhaps weeks. The handwriting changed further, lines stretching unevenly, ink bleeding into the paper where his hands must have shaken. He wrote of hunger as a physical sound, a gnawing inside his head. He rationed his breath to conserve energy. He claimed he could smell iron in the air, like blood, though he was alone. "The ground hums beneath me," one entry reads. "It answers when I speak." The rational soldier was gone. What remained was a man dissolving into the silence of his own mind. Still, he clung to routine. Each morning, he recorded what little he could observe: the flicker of his dying lantern, the sound of frost cracking along the concrete walls, the faint echo of something scraping outside the door. "It stops when I listen," he wrote, "as if it waits for me to forget." Historians reading his diary later debated whether his madness came from starvation or fear. The tone was poetic, yes, but there was a sharp logic beneath the delirium, as though he was documenting something real in the only language he had left. He began to refer to the forest as if it were a living presence, something vast and aware. "It watches through the seams," he wrote. "When I close my eyes, I see its roots pressed against the concrete. It wants me to open the door. On another page, the handwriting suddenly steadies, precise again. It speaks in the voice of the missing. I do not answer. That entry is dated December 12, 1943, the last date that can be clearly read. From there, the diary devolves into fragments, whole lines scratched out, ink stains covering phrases that might have explained what happened next. He drew small sketches along the margins, circles connected by lines, perhaps maps, perhaps hallucinations. One image stands out, a crude depiction of a man lying beneath the earth, surrounded by branches that twist into his ribs. On the final page, a single sentence sprawls across the bottom. I have sealed it out, or sealed myself in. I cannot tell which. Forensic analysts later confirmed that the shelter's interior latch had been locked from the inside. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. Vogel had secured himself deliberately. The lantern was found burned out, its fuel long evaporated. A single bullet remained in his sidearm, untouched. It was not suicide he had chosen, but containment. The man who once followed orders, who transported whatever horror his mission had unleashed, had become its final jailer. When the archaeologists reopened the shelter decades later, the air inside was heavy with decay and the scent of old metal. The door bore faint scratches along the concrete edge, but no marks of panic, only small, deliberate notches, as though Vogel had been counting. His body was never found, but his uniform jacket was folded neatly on the cot, buttons aligned, the insignia dulled with time. The diary rested beside it, its pages curled from dampness but intact, the ink frozen in its last confession. There is something unbearable in that final image, a man surrounded by the ghosts of his own orders, sealing himself inside the very place meant to protect him. The forest outside, unchanged, continued to breathe, and within that concrete tomb, Reinhard Vogel disappeared not as a deserter or a coward, but as the last witness to something no one was meant to see. When the archaeologists stepped back into daylight, they said the air felt thicker around the trees, as if the forest still remembered the man who had listened too closely to its whisper. The war ended, but the forest never forgot. In the decades that followed, it grew thick again, reclaiming trenches and craters, swallowing the last traces of barbed wire and steel. The people who had once feared its edge rebuilt their lives in silence, pretending not to remember the soldiers who vanished inside. In time, the story of the sealed-off woods became something between a warning and a lullaby. Parents told their children not to wander too far past the old birch line, where the air turned still and the ground began to hum after rain. They said the forest belonged to the captain now, the one who had refused to come home. By the 1960s, the war debris began to surface again, drawn up by frost and time. A child found a rusted helmet along the creek, its rim split clean through. Another uncovered a strange metal box buried in the mud, its hinges fused shut. The local priest ordered it reburied without opening it. Adults spoke quietly about cursed relics, things better left untouched. A few teenagers, emboldened by curiosity, ventured deeper and returned pale, claiming they'd heard knocking beneath the soil or seen faint light between the trees at dusk. No one believed them, but no one asked them to prove it either. The silence surrounding the forest had become its own kind of faith. The villagers gave the place a name that did not appear on any map: Der Wald des Flüsterns, the Forest of Whispers. To them, it wasn't haunted in the way stories usually are. It was patient, solemn, like a cemetery that had never been blessed. People learned to skirt around its boundaries, their footsteps unconsciously quickening as they passed. Even hunters avoided it. The deer that crossed its edge were said to emerge thin and trembling, as if chased by something unseen. In the 1,980 seconds, a logging company petitioned to cut a section of the woods for timber. The first machines arrived, and the work lasted 2 days. On the third morning, the crew refused to enter. One man swore he heard voices echoing from the soil. Another said his saw had seized as though biting into stone. When the foreman inspected the tree trunk they had half felled, he found a thin line of metal embedded deep within the grain, running parallel to the earth. The work was abandoned. The forest was left alone again. Meanwhile, beneath its surface, the shelter endured. The soil thickened, moss draped across its entrance like a burial shroud. Inside, the air stayed cold and still. The wooden cot decayed first, collapsing under its own weight, followed by the lantern, which corroded into a sculpture of ash and metal. The diary, protected in its oilcloth wrapping, survived. Each season laid another layer of secrecy above it, leaves, frost, roots, until the world above had no memory of the man within. The story of Captain Reinhard Vogel faded into rumor, a name spoken only by those who remembered the occupation. To the younger generations, he became a mythic figure, the soldier who defied his orders and vanished into the trees. Some said he had deserted, driven mad by guilt or isolation. Others believed he was cursed, transformed into one of the forest's guardians. On fog-heavy mornings, when the mist rolled low, farmers swore they saw a figure standing at the edge of the pines, dressed in a uniform too clean for its age, always silent, always watching. Time reshaped the war into memory, and memory into legend. When the Iron Curtain fell, and the maps changed once more, the forest remained untouched, a green scar across the landscape. Scientists passed through the area with their instruments, but their reports were brief, inconclusive. Soil readings were inconsistent, compasses misbehaved. The ground, they noted, seemed to pulse faintly with temperature shifts unconnected to weather patterns. No one investigated further. For the villagers, the story no longer needed proof. It had become something deeper, woven into the rhythm of their lives. Children grew up knowing not to follow the faint paths that led toward the center of the forest. They knew the tale by heart, the captain who sealed himself away, because he had seen something he could not unsee. When storms swept through the region, lightning sometimes struck the same cluster of trees near where the old maps marked military zone. Each time, the smell of iron filled the air. Each time, the forest absorbed it without sound. And beneath that stillness, beneath decades of earth and roots, the shelter persisted. The metal door held fast, the name Reinhard Vogel barely legible under the corrosion. Inside, the last fragments of his world waited, untouched. The diary, the photograph, the sidearm, all preserved by accident and silence. The man was gone, but the forest had kept his promise. Only I remain. When the bunker was finally opened in the early months of 2024, it was not soldiers or scavengers who crossed the threshold, but scientists. The air that escaped was thick, metallic, and faintly sweet, the kind of scent that clings to old blood or iron left too long in the rain. The research team from Warsaw University arrived under the guise of historical preservation, funded partly by a European Heritage Grant and partly by an unnamed private donor. Their goal, officially, was to document and conserve. Unofficially, it was to answer a question that had been gnawing at historians since the diary's first translation. What exactly had happened to Captain Reinhard Vogel in the winter of 1943? The shelter itself was pristine in its decay. Instruments registered unusually low humidity levels for such a confined underground space. The concrete walls had resisted erosion far better than expected, and the metal fixtures showed minimal rusting despite the decades. When ultraviolet lights were introduced to map structural weaknesses, the team noticed faint patches along the wall that absorbed the light, differently streaks that shimmered faintly under the lens, as if coated in a thin biological film. Samples were collected carefully, sealed in sterile vials, and sent to a laboratory in Krakow for analysis. The results, when they came back, only deepened the mystery. The residue was organic, but it didn't match any known mold, fungus, or bacterial strain. Under magnification, it appeared to be composed of microscopic filaments resembling plant roots, but each cell contained trace amounts of metallic compounds, iron, zinc, and traces of something synthetic. "It's neither living nor dead," one biochemist wrote in her preliminary notes. "It behaves like tissue, but without decay. It reacts to light. It shouldn't exist." Carbon dating of the diary pages placed their creation firmly in 1943, confirming the authenticity of Vogel's final writings. Yet embedded in the ink were microscopic anomalies, mineral particles that seemed to originate not from the local soil, but from some industrial source, possibly airborne contamination. Some suspected Vogel had used non-standard ink, perhaps something issued for field reports, though no record of such material exists. Even stranger was what the digital reconstruction of the diary revealed. Using multispectral imaging, the team recovered words previously thought illegible, hidden under smudged ink and water stains. Among them were several lines that had been violently scratched out by Vogel himself. The software pieced together fragments. "The forest is not soil, it is skin." And another, "The ground moves when it breathes." The lead investigator, Dr. Marek Nowicki, held a press briefing after months of analysis. His tone was cautious, his statements measured. The team had, he said, found no evidence of external interference or post-war tampering. He confirmed that the shelter had been sealed from within and that no remains were discovered. When asked about the organic residue, he dismissed it as a natural byproduct of prolonged humidity and microbial adaptation. But those who had been present during the excavation later claimed that Nowicki's answer was not entirely truthful. Some of the team members, it was said, had been quietly reassigned after submitting their findings to military channels. The samples taken from the shelter were never returned from government custody. Unofficial transcripts from internal discussions paint a more unsettling picture. A geologist involved in the survey reported detecting electromagnetic fluctuations in the soil, directly above the shelter, brief pulses recurring at irregular intervals. Another noted that the vegetation near the site exhibited abnormal resilience. Moss that refused to dry even in direct sun, bark that remained damp weeks after rain. "It's as if the ecosystem is compensating for something beneath it," she said in her notes. The data was logged but later removed from the final publication. The official report, released under the Ministry of Culture, was clinical and cold. It made no mention of anomalies, no suggestion of biological irregularities. It simply stated that Captain Reinhard Vogel, presumed deceased, had perished in isolation due to psychological deterioration and environmental factors. The cause of death was marked as undetermined. In a small footnote, nearly lost in the appendix, a single line summarized what had been months of investigation. No external agents were identified in the surrounding soil or structural composition, though traces of unidentified organic residue persist, source unknown. When journalists pressed for more, the ministry closed the case. The site was sealed again under new conservation laws. A fence went up around the perimeter, marked with warnings about sinkholes and contamination. But local residents claimed that at night, when the wind shifted, the same low hum could still be heard beneath the ground. The scientists had left, but the forest remained unchanged, watchful, breathing. In the following spring, satellite imagery revealed a new pattern of vegetation spreading outward from the site, circular and perfect, as if something beneath had begun to grow. Officially, it was dismissed as a coincidence of soil chemistry. Unofficially, those who had seen the photographs wondered whether Vogel's final words were not madness at all, but observation. The forest, they said, had kept evolving long after the man was gone, and whatever had lived in those walls might still be listening, waiting beneath the moss for another door to open. The voice begins softly, almost a whisper against the static hiss of old tape. The final passage from Vogel's diary is read in translation, the words steady but trembling with exhaustion. "I have stopped fearing death," he wrote. "It is the waiting that kills. The forest listens." The narrator lets the silence stretch afterward, letting those last 3 words hang in the air like breath. On screen, the camera drifts across the forest at dusk, the light sinking into amber. The bunker's entrance sits half buried in the earth, the doorway gaping in black. Moss moves gently in the wind, a slow rhythm that feels alive. For a moment, it almost looks like the ground itself is exhaling. The documentary's final act splices Vogel's words with archival footage, grainy reels of soldiers moving through snow, faces turned away from the camera, their outlines fading into fog. Overlaid are fragments of his handwriting, trembling across the screen. The air hums. The ground remembers. His final pages are disjointed, fragmented by time and madness. But there's a strange lucidity in the way he writes about the forest, as if he's describing not terror, but communion. "It does not wish to harm," one line reads, "only to know that I am listening." The handwriting is faint there, almost tender. Yet the next entry, written in darker ink and erratic strokes, turns cold. It asked for silence. It wanted to be alone. "I cannot leave, for it would follow." As the film transitions between those lines, the music dissolves into low ambient tones, subtle vibrations that echo the pulse recorded by the scientists decades later. A visual overlay of soil and root structures blends with the image of the bunker floor. The narrator continues, quoting from Vogel's last coherent paragraph. "I no longer pray. I no longer write for Clara. I only write so the silence will not have me. There is something beautiful about surrender when no one is left to remember your name." His final words, uneven and nearly illegible, seem written in a shaking hand. The forest listens. The documentary ends without explaining what the scientists found, without clarifying what Vogel transported, without offering comfort. Instead, it leaves the viewer with what cannot be measured: the space between reason and dread. The camera returns one last time to the forest, shot from a low angle at twilight. Mist crawls along the ground. The trees stand unmoving, yet there is an illusion of motion, as if their shadows inch forward between frames. A faint sound seeps through the ambient noise, something between wind and a voice. Subtitles label it simply, "Unverified Audio Anomaly." Interviews play beneath the closing narration. One historian admits that she no longer believes Vogel was delusional. His descriptions match the electromagnetic readings. He wasn't hallucinating, he was perceiving something we can't yet define. Another voice, older and worn, speaks from the shadows. It belongs to one of the original villagers, now nearly a century old. "They say he went mad," she says, "but maybe he understood. Maybe he became part of it." Her words fade into the rustle of leaves. The final sequence lingers on the bunker again, the moss now almost luminous in the fading light. The color grading deepens toward green and gray. The wind picks up, swaying the plants around the entrance until they seem to breathe in rhythm with the earth. The camera holds still, no narrator speaks. Only the faint vibration of the air remains, a hum so low it borders on silence. For nearly 30 seconds, nothing happens, and yet everything in the frame feels aware, alert, waiting. When the screen finally cuts to black, the sound continues for a heartbeat longer, a single sustained note that wavers, then disappears. There are no credits for the scientists, no concluding statement from the filmmakers, only a final subtitle drawn from Vogel's recovered notes. "If you listen long enough, it will answer." Then the screen fades entirely, and the darkness hums like the forest might still be breathing beyond it. Long after the documentary ends, viewers describe a lingering unease, an almost physical quiet in the moments that follow. Some claim to hear a faint resonance in the room, a low vibration under the hum of their own devices. The rational explanation, of course, is nothing more than sound design and suggestion. But for those who've seen the footage of that moss-covered doorway and heard Vogel's voice from the page, there's a different truth, something not to be solved, but remembered. The story offers no closure, no revelation, only the echo of a man who vanished into silence, and the suggestion that silence, once awakened, does not forget.